I know a little bit about your background because you told it to me, but I maybe lost some of the details. But I know that you were working at an early point in your budding career for David Birk, I think, in Peterborough. So, of course, the interest I have is in how you got to work with David Birk in Peterborough, and of course, subsequently, how you came to be here now in your studio in Toronto as a very well-respected and well-known both artist and teacher, career professional artist, and that's quite a journey. So, do you want to just retrace that?
I can try. It's a long story, but I'll try not to be long-winded. Well, when I was in Peterborough, I was a musician, and Peterborough is a place that breeds professional musicians like nowhere in this country that I can think of. And so that's what I was doing. I was playing in a number of different bands, and I met some people connected to the Peterborough arts community. And there was two main institutions there. There was the Art Gallery of Peterborough, and there was Artscape. And it seemed as though David Birk had somehow been at the forefront of both of those institutions forming at all. And yet no one ever saw David. He was a very private person, and so I was aware of him, and I was aware of the studio, but I had no idea what they had done, and I'd never met a professional artist before. Being a professional musician, it's an artist of a kind, but completely different in most ways. So I needed a part-time job, and I heard that David was hiring people to help him move his studio. He had a building on the other side of the street from where his studio was that he'd bought, and it was moving his inventory. And I had a friend who was working there, and she put forward my name as a person at large who would be more than happy to help. And it was great because I'd never seen an artist's studio before. David was a painter primarily, and had this old warehouse of a building with all of these paintings, and they were big and they were beautiful, and they were more than just eye candy. There was some thoughts going on and some ideas mixed into the work, and it just impressed me so much that not only was my first introduction to an artist somebody who was, an interesting person, not a frivolous person, but he seemed to be making quite a good living at doing this. He bought a building, and I just thought, oh, well, this is interesting. So I helped move the inventory, and then worked my way up to helping build the frames, and then became responsible for gessoing canvases, and then got promoted to doing underpaintings, and then quickly wanted to get demoted again. Because working in another artist's studio was not an easy relationship for David or myself, and I suspect that our personalities weren't well suited to that. Probably shouldn't say things like this. Anyway, working in David's studio was definitely really interesting. It was an education. He had a really big career with books and touring exhibitions and publications, and he generated all kinds of artwork, and at the same time he was at the very end of his career, and he knew it. He was already sick and dying, and he let that be known. So I knew that I was on a sinking ship, and my career as a musician wasn't really working out as well as I'd hoped. But in the time that I'd been working for David, I had taken over some of his old studio space and had set up my own studio practice, which was primarily photography, drawing, painting, and a bit of film, and had been connecting with artists through Artspace and the art gallery. And they would come to my studio and they'd say, well, you've got talent and you seem like a really interesting person, but the art that you're making, it's just not that interesting. And I didn't really think of what I was making as art. I thought of it as studies. I was learning how to draw representationally. I was learning how to make a good photograph. I was learning how to glaze and scumble, and so I hadn't really thought of my work as art until these artists came to the studio and started thinking it that way. And they all said the same thing. They said, you should go to art school. You need to learn about art. I thought, well, this is a good idea. So, as I said, the ship was sinking, and art school seemed like a good place to go. And so I got an apartment in Toronto, and I went to OCAD. On my very first day of class was September 11th, 2001. So it kind of set the tone for a new era. But I arrived as a person with, I was motivated, I was curious, I was passionate. I had seen a bit of what was possible, but I never made another painting again. Not that I have any difficulty with paintings, but what I got at art school was that ideas and materials and spaces are really the core of a work, and that creating a context was the work, that the painting didn't serve that somehow. So that surprised me, and I just kept doing it. I kind of had to. There was an innate desire, lists of ideas that needed to be made and explored, and often they were never designed to be seen or exhibited. They were just things to work through, things that I'd become critical of. At one point, believing that art history was a noble institution and then realizing its failings, and so wanting not to turn my back on the institution but make art out of it, to try and make it a raw material for exploration. I don't know how you show that, but that was never the goal, but it was to work through all these ideas of what that might mean.
Well, here you are, seated between heaven and hell, and very materially so. And yet we have here the idea of heaven and hell, of paradise and its obverse. I'm kind of curious about the relations that you were just touching on between materiality and ideas, between, I guess, the materialization of ideas, if you can put it that way. Any thoughts?
Well, for certain. Well, I think ideas are really pure things, and they're very difficult to express. Language is a good way of doing it, but visually, I'd like to try and steer away from metaphor whenever possible. And I like to use materials that already have meaning associated to them. So with a work like this, it comes out of previously existing artworks. The clouds were all formed in various art publications, ones that described both heaven and hell. And so there was this interesting similarity between those types of clouds. I thought it was interesting that they shared the same landscape architecture. But the idea was nothing about heaven and hell for me, but it was the idea of the infinite, of the eternal, of foreverness. And I thought, one of the ways that people express their interest and their desire for a forever was through their estimation, their creation, their visualization of the afterlife and the notion of a eternity that comes in time. And so as signifiers of eternity, these things seemed already to fill that void. But then I liked the polarity of heaven and hell, and I liked the notion that there was no singular afterlife, but that it was duplicitous at best, and that it went in many directions, had many possibilities, as eternity surely must. But I also like the naive quality of that Judeo-Christian afterlife. So these seem to fill that gap nicely for me. So by collaging together other clouds from other ideas of that history and putting them together into a composite history, it became the idea. The idea became the object.
Tell me a little bit about the process of constructing heaven and hell here.
Well, it was... I should thank the Canada Council for generously funding it because it was expensive. The idea Well, I've been doing a lot of carving. I'd been doing a lot of relief sculpture. I'd been primarily working with the idea of text. And I was particularly interested in text that described clouds. Clouds being this, to me, emblem of ephemerality and of impermanence. And I was really interested in that. And I still am. And so I would make these relief carvings that would describe clouds on a certain day at a certain time, the sun or the wind coming at a certain moment. But usually they would be moments that were hundreds of years old, and sort of a monument to the passing of an antique cloud. So working from that perspective, the idea of carving images of clouds struck me as being a good idea. And so finding material that would support that would be light enough and portable enough, and that could be done in a lifetime, became the question. So for these, it started off as drawings that got turned into computer-generated vector graphics, and then using a combination of CNC machines and hand tools. They got roughed in by the CNC machines and then carved by hand to sort of finish them up. And there's actually 4 panels. There's only 3 present, but there's 4 panels, and it's intentionally broken up. I knew that I was playing with fire by doing anything that might try and depict anybody else's image of the afterlife. And so I didn't want it to be too perfect. I wanted there to be something exactly wrong with it at all moments. And with this work, I think it's really quite difficult to look at. It does something strange to the optic nerve. It vibrates. I don't even know if the camera could pick it up. So I liked that as a sort of an additional factor in the work, the notion of a unassailable afterlife, or an intangible infinite. And I think infinity is intangible, and yet we talk about it. It's a concept that is slippery, and I wanted the work to have that too. I didn't want it to be just right. I didn't want it to have all the answers, but I wanted it to be well made enough to seduce you into thinking about the questions. Not sure if that answers the question so well, but
well, in a way, then that we can talk about material and ideas, but we have to talk about the process, and I guess process is that mode by which you forward the existence of the material and the idea, and becomes the play. You might say. Would you say the process is the play?
Oh yeah, the play. I like that word. It's a lot of fun to be in the studio and to be lost in the process of making things, and to have a process that you understand or are working through to try and understand and just do. So much of life is in planning, and so much of life is in not knowing what's happening next. And in the process of the studio, you just get to do and find and know your material and your process. And it sets up a space in which meaning is being created. And while things are being created, they become the things that the idea wants them to be. So they're not images, the ideas become objects in a way, or the objects and ideas interpolate in a way that you can't separate them. And I love that moment, because that's when it's fun, and it's when magic happens. That's when things become more than the sum of their parts. And there's this excitement that happens. You want to see it finished. But when you get to the end, it's usually quite anticlimactic. It never is quite what it was when you were working on it. So that's the game.
A game. A game. Is this what an artist does? Play a game?
In a way, yes. I don't know if artists have any special knowledge or know anything different than anybody else does. But I think what an artist likes to do is take those thoughts, those ideas that they find interesting, and bring them to light and explore them and turn them around in their multifaceted complexity and see what those ideas look like. Complex ideas are really difficult to see, and language is a great way of expressing that, and artwork can distill things in concentrated forms that other people can then look at and imagine their way through or alongside or against, for that matter. I think art is actually quite noble because it is something, it's a permission to imagine possibilities that maybe have already been imagined but have become difficult to accept. It can be a way of introducing ideals that are at the core of a whole community or society, but putting them into play, putting them into space and giving them a space for conversation. And when the ideas are difficult, then the conversation is more interesting, because then people can't necessarily have one thing to agree upon, but many points of view can come into play. And to me, that's the conversation, many conversations. Mm-hmm. So I think that's what artists do. They open up the possibilities for many conversations to take place. There's no answer. Mm. In fact, if I can reflect a bit on teaching a bit, one thing that I always find students will say when people understand a project is that you got it. You hit the nail right on the head. And I always think, what a pity. Because I wouldn't want that for my work. To me, hitting the nail on the head is not the point of work. It's not ornamentation. It's not a instruction. It's a point of contemplation, one that is informed by the object and the material and the concept. And when those things come together, there is an inertia that's created. And that's the work. There's no knowing where that will go.
I'm interested by a particular work because I want to ask the question. Now that I hear you speak about this, Adam, I'm not sure I want to ask the question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Let's say the question is, how would you define the core concept, or the core idea, the core strategy, however one would want to define that, that underlines and defines your practice? But maybe I can approach it through a particular work. Mm-hmm. And if you want to quote another work, no, I'm quoting, go ahead. But I'm interested by the word life, which, as I recall, was this the word life written on the wall of the gallery, Michael Klein, in red eraser, the classic school boy red eraser thing. And of course, written in eraser, it could be easily erased. But I'd like to hear you talk about that work in terms of how you see the strategies that underlie it.
Well, that work is I think actually best encapsulates the ideal work for me, because the work life has a conceptual underpinning and a material that supports it, to me, ideally. And the concept maybe is a bit complex in some sense. The ephemerality of life, the possibility of life both existing and not existing at the same time, or in the fullness of time. And then the material, the pink pearl eraser, which is it's a mark-making device when I rub it on the wall, but it's designed to erase. So two things happen by using the eraser as a mark-making device. You leave a mark, but you also leave a fair amount of eraser on the floor. And so there's almost equal parts eraser on the wall and eraser on the floor. And so the work oscillates between being a wall drawing and an object in the space. There's this sort of field of pink pearl dust on the floor. And that strikes me as being a very beautiful idea. When I think about life, what life is, no one person can say, but the complexity of a life is being particles that are both united and disintegrating, age and use, both the making and unmaking simultaneously happening. That kind of progressive ephemerality that defines any life struck me as being very profound. And I wanted the material of the work to have a kind of poetry that would come close to expressing that profound notion. So the material and the word and the space and the fact that it couldn't come off the wall by mere touch was part of the work. What amazed me was with this incredibly fragile work that nobody touched it, and it stayed pristine throughout the entire exhibition. I would have thought that someone would bump it, or rub it, or touch it, and that didn't happen. So there was this respect for life that I was delighted to see, but surprised nonetheless. But there's been other works where I've used the pink pearl strategy, if you can call it that, where the material of the eraser as the mark-making device was such an ironic mark-making device that it gives a kind of agency to the work and a kind of material meaning to the work, and using words that relate to the notion of erasure, like shh, which is a word that seems to be universal in application. In any language, people share that word to instigate silence. And the eraser as a silencing device makes me think about the difficulty and the complexity of the possibility of silence. And so the possible meanings that generates for me are wonderful and manifold. And so bringing together words and materials like that really seemed productive. So we'll see if it can continue to be productive, but it's challenging to find the right combinations.
There's another work of yours based upon the Rosetta Stone, and I'm thinking about that because so much of your work circulates around language, and what is language? What do we do with it, you might say? What are you doing with it? The Rosetta Stone piece, you'll have to describe it. But.
Right. Well, the Rosetta Stone piece, there's two versions of it, but the one I'll describe is the first one that I made. I took the language of the Rosetta Stone, and the Rosetta Stone is this marvelous piece of an Egyptian obelisk that was put forward by one of the pharaohs, and it was essentially a political statement. It described how much barley had been harvested that year and how many millions of gold ducats or what have you that got given to the temple. A political statement. So the content of the message itself wasn't that important, but what was important was that it contained three different languages in it: the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic, their Demotic language, and ancient Greek. And both the Demotic language and the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic language had been completely lost. Nobody knew how to read them anymore. They were gone from human knowledge. So they were an enigma. And when they found the stone, because of the ancient Greek, they were able to translate the stone. So it became this wonderful icon of language and of evolution of language. But to me, it also was a symbol of imperialism and or of empire, and of, I guess what you might call kind of I don't know what to call it actually, the layers and depths that exist within a culture. All of these things existing at the same time. We don't think of ancient Egypt as being ancient Greece, but it was actually controlled by the Greeks. So anyway, these difficult layered associations is what stone actually is. So, and it's kept in England. They won't let it go anywhere. So it means a lot to them and their empire. So I was fascinated with the object, and so what I wanted to do was take this object, the language on the Rosetta Stone, and really look at it. And when I looked at it, it just occurred to me that language is as ephemeral as any society. That cultures come and go, empires come and go, civilizations come and go, and language is part of all of that. And that no one language is eternal. And yet, if there ever was a civilization that represents eternity on this planet, the ancient Egyptians have cornered that. And so I wanted to make a version of that from its fragmentary source. But I wanted it to also be ephemeral. So I used a chalkboard as the base for the work, and used chalk in order to replicate the writings, so the Egyptian hieroglyphic, the Demotic, and the ancient Greek. And I wanted it to be on a one-to-one scale, so I had to do a lot of interesting things. First I had to contact the British Museum, who own the stone, possess the stone, and get them to send me a one-to-one diagram of the stone. At first they sent me a photograph, which was illegible, and then they sent me a tracing of that, which I was able to turn into a stencil. And then using powdered chalk, was able to apply it to the surface of the chalkboard. So it's very ephemeral. It's if you rubbed your hand on it, it would disappear. And that struck me as being, again, this moment of, I guess, of poetic balance between the materials that it was being made out of, the chalk, the ephemerality of language itself, and the possibility of total loss. And I guess the reason the Rosetta Stone seemed an interesting subject for this was because in our contemporary computers, Rosetta technology is a translation technology. It's a way that computers understand old languages, but it's also a program one can use to translate languages. So the notion of the Rosetta as a key to understanding language has stayed with us. I don't know, maybe it always will. So there's that poetic, do this with my hands. It's a give and take. It's slippery. It almost defies explanation. Whenever I try and describe it, it almost seems like I'm doing a disservice to the work. Maybe that's why I make it instead of talk about it.
But here we are talking about it. I'm interested about your relationship to art history, to the practices of other artists. And I guess if we're quoting the Rosetta Stone, we can talk about history. What's your take on art history? Its importance for you?
Art history. Well, art history. I think art history is extremely important and fascinating and insufficient, or at least incomplete. There's so much to be gained from studying other artists' work and their practices. There's so much to be gained from seeing the work in person, going to museums or exhibitions. There's so much to be gained from collecting books and meeting artists. It's a wealth of knowledge and a wealth of understanding and alternatives to the norm, which I think are extremely important. I think a lot of art history is actually a very slow revolution, which is part of the change that society sees again and again. And one term that I really like, I got from Albert Einstein, he in turn got it from his hero, Sir Isaac Newton, was this notion of standing on the shoulders of giants. And I feel that there is a conversation that can be had with art from the past that extends into the present, and the possibility of comprehending or extending the narrative of past artists is one that can be a part of a contemporary practice. And I don't mean remaking their work or copying them, it's not like that, but seeing their strategies and seeing where they left off or could have gone but never did, or seeing that a revolution is actually in process and that we're still part of it, but it's been going on for a long time, and that it's really important not to return to a less advanced or sophisticated or intellectual or critical moment. So art history is really important for that. It also shows you again and again that the impulse to be unique, the impulse to be original, the impulse to be the only one is a myth. That things are like other things, and that's okay. So, standing on the shoulders of giants is a way of reaching higher.
We can talk about this question of standing on the shoulders of giants, and here we are. Are we standing on the shoulders of giants? I'm interested what your take is on the contemporary moment. You were building towards the idea of the contemporary moment. What is the contemporary moment, that one that we're actually in at the moment, and the one that you're in? I'm kind of curious what your thought about current discourse is, or how the current moment is actually defining itself for, I guess, what will ultimately be art history.
Well, the current moment is, of course, many moments. But I think one of the through lines that I perceive is a notion of the past and the future working simultaneously. And I think one of the defining moments of this contemporary period is what I call the culture of use. People are using things as raw materials. It could be the text of another artist. It could be the work of another artist. It could be an object, manufactured object. And the languages that are contained within these objects, the histories that are contained within these objects, are the raw material. So they've, to some degree, replaced the canvas and the paint of the traditional studio. And I feel like visual language is maybe even a better word than art practice. I feel like this moment in time is people finding ways of expressing meaning through visual language that is created less through illusionistic drawings or materialized textures, but through the placement of objects in relation to one another. And that maybe isn't new, but it's accepted. It can be taken for granted as a mode in which to work. And I think that's really exciting, actually, because it opens up the space around the objects. They take on meanings that maybe previously they only supported. And I think that's what's interesting. I also think there is something really important about this moment, which is, of course, the internet. The space that work travels through and how it is consumed and perceived, and the fact that it's perceived as being consumed is really interesting. I think it's yet to be determined what that's going to mean, and I'm thinking about younger generations, maybe even younger than myself, but the acceptance of that medium as a space, a real space, and the potential for that, and the way works are disseminated through that, seen through that, perceived through that medium, is a huge part of the contemporary moment. And what I find really interesting is that, at least with artists of my generation, that the studio becomes a location or broadcast point through that medium, and there's a network that forms. So the studio itself has become a subject for the work, and I find that really interesting as well. So I think those describe what I think as this moment, this contemporary moment.
Well, that leads me to another question, and that is the fact that your work is certainly circulated around language. It's also circulated around time. In fact, I'm tempted to say around the space-time continuum that we associate with relativity or whatever, but I don't want to put words in your mouth. But I'm kind of curious if you would like to talk a little bit about this question of time. And we just brought another work out into the studio. I wonder if you'd talk about that in terms of that.
Well, this particular work I titled it Space-Time. Space-time is a way of estimating time that is not limited to people on a planet. We are planetary confined. Our 24-hour day is a consequence of our spinning planet and our journey around the sun and various manifestations of human invention. But off the planet, time is much more expansive and deeply interesting and potentially infinite. And I really like thinking about infinity and the infinite. It's a concept, it's a very slippery concept, and some say a very dangerous one. But I like to think of time as also having a notion of location. So for a work like this, it's the Roman numerals of the clock, from 1 to 12. And it's been drawn illusionistically, as though it were moving through space. But I drew it with a candle. And so it's a smoke drawing. And what is captured is this ephemeral billow. And so to sort of illustrate time as being ephemeral and as being indefinable and as being in the process of its own disintegration struck me as a way of reckoning with the infinite that is space-time and the speed that time evaporates. It's an interesting one. So yeah, this work, there's many thoughts that go into something like this, but the work is made out of smoke. It's made out of soot particles. It's not a normal mark making tool, but it's pure carbon. So there's an elemental sense to the work. It's just carbon that's been captured, and it's sort of a register of time, like a litmus strip of some kind. So that factors through a lot of works.
Mm-hmm. One question before we break. Time, language, the infinite. How do you move from one body of work to another?
That's a good question. I guess when I'm making a work, I'm always aware of the failings of that work to express any single idea or any sequence of ideas that I may be trying to express within a single work. And I don't let that stop me, or else I wouldn't make the work. But my solution to that, my solution to the inadequacy of any one work, is to make other connected works that try to capture the different possibilities in a concept or an idea. So language as an expression of time can dovetail with images of the infinite, which can connect to images that are contemporary hieroglyphics that are designed to last a billion years, which would seem infinite, until you measure that against the scale of the universe, in which a billion years becomes just a drop in the bucket. And so it's like one idea couched within another. So in some sense, they're all one thing. And it's a question of my research or my interest that allows me to take a different direction. So I don't really see them as being disparate at all, actually. They're all a continuation of one thought or one reverie that has many points of contact and my limited capacity to reach out towards those things.
Reach out towards the infinite.
To reach towards the infinite.
How important is the general public for you?
I don't know. Well, I think it's important that when there's an exhibition or when the work is being presented, that there's a public to witness the work. It's important to me to get feedback from people. It's important for me to hear what people think, because for me, while I'm making the work, so much thought goes into it that it helps me determine whether or not I'm getting across a message, the one that I would want to get across. For me, the notion that the work be regarded from its conceptual basis is the most important one. So it's not necessarily important that people get the work, but that they understand that there's something going on in the work that can initiate some kind of conversation. So in that sense, it's important, but I'm quite shy and don't like crowds very much. So I'm rarely around the work when other people are, except in the studio, of course.
So in terms of reception, or in terms of address, perhaps even, it would be critical response or curatorial response would be fundamental to your requirements.
Well, working with curators is great because it's sort of like having a coach in your corner. They have your best interests at heart. At least that's been my experience. And they help you to develop an idea beyond what seems like its obvious manifestation, and take it beyond that obvious manifestation into something that might be bigger or smaller, but more developed. And I cherish that because I think that's the one thing that artists need the most is mechanisms which help them to develop their work. They need to get outside of themselves. We get in our own way. Our own limitations are easy to accept, and a curator, or critic for that matter, can push you beyond that. So you can find yourself moving beyond your limitations or looking for other ways of expressing it because maybe they've made you aware of someone else's work and you think, okay, I won't go that way, I can go this way. So in that sense, being part of that conversation is super important and usually fun. The thing that I guess curators do is they encourage you, but they don't think about the budgetary restrictions that encouragement might entail. So you head towards ideals. And if art isn't a project that involves ideals, I don't know what is. So it's great that they're there.
One other articulation of ideals, of course, is the responsibility of the critic. And I just wonder, critics differ from curators in the sense that they don't have an investment in supporting the work. What's your experience with critics?
That's an interesting question. Well, I guess the first thing I think about critics and writers is the investment that they put into the work. They have to really look hard, and they're publishing this. So you know that it's something of a concern for them, or they wouldn't bother. I think critics are actually a lot like artists. Rarely is anyone asking us to do this. It's a project that you manifest out of your own passions and ideals. And so when they engage in a work, to me it's an opportunity to learn about your own work. It's a way of seeing the work through somebody else's eyes. But I guess the other thing that I find particularly interesting about critics is that they use language to describe the work, whereas the work comes out of language so often for me. So it's almost a reversal of the work. And that's a really interesting and reflective moment. And if it can go both ways, if it can be constituted and then deconstituted through language, then maybe the work is a success, at least in some small way.
The question of theory. Well, maybe I'm going to link it to the fact that you teach. And I'm kind of curious about the role that theory plays in your work, of course, and whether the theoretical constructs that you treat in the academy become part of your practice in the studio.
Definitely. And for me, theory has always been a mechanism for giving permission to do something that you didn't think was possible before, or of understanding things in a way that you had failed to grasp previously. Theory opens up possibilities, and it includes more. And to me, that's a really important thing. As an instructor of sculpture or installation or teacher, or whatever you want to call it, it's about inclusivity. It's about finding ways to get people into the discourse, or whatever discourse they find suitable to them. And theory opens up possibilities, opens up doors. It also opens up language. And language so often is the wellspring from which artworks appear from. So, it's a way of giving things names. And so I think it's important. For me, it's a way of answering questions. Sometimes a theory can back up a particular concept. Sometimes a theory can give a strategy that'll help solve a problem. It can help you name something. Theory and history kind of go hand in hand too. So sometimes it's like, sometimes being acquainted with a theory or being immersed in a sort of framework that a theory creates for you is a way of traveling, of moving through an ideological space that is certainly gratifying in terms of progress within the studio, but maybe even part of connecting to a larger discourse. Discourse with artists that are on the other side of the world, or maybe no longer living. Sort of an accumulation or an accretion of ideas, and theory is it's maybe the force that accelerates those ideas. So for me, it's present, but it operates in the background. It's not overt. I don't run to Hal Foster for advice, but I feel like I've absorbed something there, and it's unlocked doors, and so things become naturalized, and that might seem unusual at one point in the past don't anymore. So yeah, it's important. It's also really difficult. Theory as an instructor of art is tricky because it's hard to catch people in their reveries and get them to put their boats into the same flow. Sometimes it can be a bit counterproductive too.
Something related to theory, but seems to stand apart from it a little bit, is the question of mood, perhaps. And a particular mood that I'm curious about is comedy. And I think at the base of comedy there's subversion. and certainly at the base of subversion is the notion of a transcendence, of some kind of a transformation of something. I'm kind of curious to what extent within this circle of comedy and transference and so on, whether you see that as operative in the work.
Certainly, I do. I feel like I wouldn't want to make artwork that didn't have an element of subversion or of revisioning. One of the important mechanisms that an artist offers is a framing device, or a reframing device, if you will. And in my practice, it's always been extremely important to take things that have a certain kind of understanding associated with them, but then to reframe them in such a way that they could mean or do mean something else, or generate ideas that actually work against the culture from which they come. Particularly in the realms of humans imagining the infinite, or I hesitate to say things about religion, but maybe I'll say the human tendency to try and create certainties is problematic. Things are not certain, and our attempts to make things certain often ends in bloodshed. So to try and point away from certainties and try and have certainties break down in light of an artwork's presence is subversive. And at the same time, I'm not one to tell people how to think. So it's, for me, it's got to be in the work. So if I'm imagining the afterlife, it's going to have heaven and hell represented in the same landscape. And it's going to be about the infinite. It's not going to be about a religious perspective. Just the notion of the infinite and how that relates to so many cultures, so many philosophies, to so many religions. But to also provide a conduit through which it can be contemplated differently. Even just the framework of an artwork, contemporary artwork, is enough to put it in a critical framework, and then to connect it with other things that are of very disparate understanding. To take a image of the afterlife and then place that beside a pulsar map, which is something, a contemporary hieroglyphic that's designed to last for 1 billion years, that shows the finitude of the infinite, and our human incapacity for the infinite. Puts us in our place a little bit.
Which is what comedy does, of course.
Probably shouldn't include any thoughts about religion in this. It might be offensive to people. Take it
not the way you've described it. I don't think.
Well, I hope not.
I think we've addressed rather perhaps peripherally the question of teaching. Do you want to come back to the question of teaching more specifically? And I'm curious the extent to which you yourself benefit from the fact that you're teaching students at the art school.
Years ago, I did a degree in literature, and Sir Philip Sidney came up with this defense of poesy, his defense of the arts, and his estimation that the purpose of art was to delight and instruct. I liked that. I'm not so sure about the instruct part, but maybe instruct through delight. And so, being an instructor of art is very much connected to this notion of delight. I feel that the most important thing is to open people to seeing things that they wouldn't have looked at before, to thinking around things that they may not have gone to before, and to offer solutions to problems that people are trapped in, if I have them, or at least mechanisms through which they can try and solve them for themselves. And the role of mentorship is extremely important, I think. And it matters in ways that are difficult to describe. Simply to have a senior artist, an artist who you respect, admire your practice and encourage you, is of immeasurable importance. And I think that having people at an art school who want to bring people into this world of belief, this art world as we call it, and want them to believe that things are possible, is extremely important for the art world. We need voices, we need people from different backgrounds, we need people of different histories, and we need them to engage in a conversation with each other. And I feel like an art instructor is a facilitator for that conversation. An art school is a institution that facilitates those conversations, but there's too many people in an art school, so you need to break it down to smaller groups. That's the role that I think is essential. So in that sense, it goes back to delight and instruct. Bring people together and have them teach themselves to teach each other. That's an important role. It's difficult.
Another difficulty is actually to construct a career, and it seems to take a fair amount of perseverance. Do you want to speak to the perseverance that you found yourself having to cohere?
Well, no one is asking us to be artists. That much, I think, is true. But the desire or the perseverance of being an artist comes from some place innate. You can't help it. You need to see these things come together. And compromise can sometimes be very unsavory. So things develop and grow. And you need, as a person, to develop and grow. I think of being an artist as just a way of thinking. But there's a material product that comes from that thinking, and it builds up quite an accretion over time. So the exhibition is an excellent way of dealing with all those things. For me, I became an exhibiting artist by luck more than anything. And having been invited to exhibit work was a great way of moving work from one space to another to allow for the production of more thoughts, more ideas, more work. And I think that perseverance comes from the need to see the next project come into being, to see that next sequence of ideas form a trajectory, and to see if there is some meaning that can come out of it. So it's really just a desire, a need to mean something, to make meaning to yourself and to your community. So it comes back to that conversation that you're trying to have and with whom you're trying to have it. So, that perseverance maybe is also, it's a question of identity. When you speak a certain language, you need to be with those who speak that language from time to time, or else you lose your sense of self. And so that push to make the next project, that the perseverance that's required to work when you're tired or when other demands are placed upon you, it's a way of preserving yourself. It's a way of finding yourself. Maybe it's even a way of learning about yourself.
I'd like to hear your thoughts on the art system. We know what the art system is, more or less, but you can describe what you understand as the art system and perhaps your views on it.
When I think of the art system, I think of the Big Bang. as this singularity that has erupted into an infinite number of directions. And so it's a very slippery thing. But what I think the art system is it's a medium. It's a medium through which art and artists move. And there are resistances and there are places of flow. And I think maybe the artist's job is to try and position themselves in such a way as they can ride the flow. So to me, the art system, it's a supporting mechanism, but it's not necessarily aware that you're present. You have to make it aware. You have to interact with it. You have to be immersed in it. You have to find a vehicle through which you can travel within. It's a medium.
I love your mug. Well, that being the case, it's often, the question is often raised, can one work within this flow and still maintain what is real about yourself? And I guess one of the terms for that is authenticity. There are other terms as well, but any thoughts on the balance that has to occur and what authenticity actually might be?
Well, in some sense, I think authenticity comes from being true to your ideals and being true to your values. But I think another sense of authenticity is being part of a community which challenges your personality and your ideals. So it's a propositionary thing in which there is no static place. Authenticity can sometimes be an external opinion, whether somebody thinks you're being authentic or not. But I think failure is as important as success, and I think that for artists there's always this need to get outside of yourself, and sometimes you end up in an unfamiliar place, and success or failure could be the result. And I think that's a form of authenticity, not trying to be authentic. I don't think you can work from a self-conscious place. At the same time, you have to be true to a core set of principles and ideals. And I think that's important. People make compromises all the time. We were just talking about the art system, and I think the art system frequently asks us to make compromises. And my experience has been anytime I've made a compromise within the system to appease the system, it's been a mistake. And I think that artists ought to be antagonistic to the system, to the institution. They need to be. The institution would like to take you for a ride, potentially, but the question is, which side are you on? And having a position within that is a pragmatic affair.